Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jessa, and I'm so happy you're here for this episode of Better Sex. I've dedicated my professional life to helping couples enjoy a fulfilling, intimate life. I believe that sex is important. Our connections to other people matter, and we're not living our life to the fullest if we aren't connecting emotionally and sexually with our partner. That's why I'm here, bringing ideas and information to help you live and love better. Today's episode is another in the series of personal stories that I am so excited to share with you. I am finding this to be really a compelling way to be talking about sex and intimacy and relationships and how to make improvements. And so I have on the show Nancy and Frank, which are not their real names actually, but that's what we're calling them, who have been together 30 years at this point, married for 28. They've got grown children, and they're here to talk about, the struggles that they each brought in, what they call their baggage, into their marriage. For their own reasons, for their own experiences, they each had things they struggled with sexually. And it's my belief, and they bear this out, that our stuff, our baggage fits somehow with our partners, right? Like they interlock in a way that can cause some gridlock or problems. And they got together, and sure enough, they were having trouble. And so they're sharing what baggage they brought into the relationship, how that affected them in the early days of their relationship, how they communicated and what they did, what kind of growth and work did they each do to ultimately end up with a really fulfilling and rich, intimate life together. Not just sexually, but romantically, emotionally. I mean, you'll hear it. They're so invested in each other and so committed. And it's really a beautiful, message of hope. It's not like these are the same struggles that you might be having in your relationship, but the idea that you can actually get out of very difficult circumstances and make a difference and end up, so grateful and happy in your relationship down the road, I think is inspiring. So Nancy and Frank, I'm really glad they were here to share their story with you, and I hope you get a lot out of it. So Nancy and Frank, thank you so much for being with me today and being willing to share your story.
We're glad to be here.
Indeed. Thank you.
I think it's very generous of you to share, the personal story of your, the evolution of your sex life. So I appreciate it. So would you start out just sort of telling me, each of you, where you came from? What were the challenges that you each individually brought into the relationship?
So why don't I start? I was raised in a very conservative home, both politically and religiously, and that had a big impact going forward on my sex life, particularly from the religious angle. I ended up getting a fair amount of fear, shame, and guilt around the whole subject of sex growing up. And so when I finally got to the place where I could do something about it, which for me was getting married in my first time in my late 20s, I had well over a decade of mind fantasies around that whole subject that could probably never live up to the actual reality of the experience.
So did you come from a background where, sex, you shouldn't have sex till you're married and all this taboo, but suddenly when you're married, it's supposed to be great?
Yes.
Okay.
And somehow you're supposed to have kept this all under wraps and not really thought about it
right.
for years. And then on your wedding night, you're supposed to be able to suddenly flip the switch and turn it all on and have this incredible experience with Tahitian sunsets and angelic daughters, and it just didn't work like that.
Right. It sets up a lot of expectation.
A lot of expectation, and it was very awkward. And so I struggled a lot with that in my first marriage. And so even though that marriage ended, and about a couple years later, I met and married Nancy, but I still came with a lot of that stuff lingering around that I wasn't even aware of. It just sort of hovers in the background, and you sort of think, well, that's the way things are, without realizing the kind of mental oppression that you're living under that's self-imposed based on all that upbringing and programming.
And were you having any experiences of, feeling bad, judging or shame around your own sexual interests, or, whether you were fantasizing or not, or your own preferences,
Yeah, I think I had a lot of shame around just almost feeling sexual as a teenager.
Yeah.
Like somehow you're not supposed to. And then just anything that came up that triggered that would bring up shame, around it. So I came into both marriages really with this idea that, well, the only real place you can really think about this is in the context of this bedroom and this person.
Yeah.
And then suddenly everything's supposed to be okay. But if you see someone else who even triggers some thoughts in your mind, then here comes the fear and the shame and the guilt for even thinking that.
Right. And I'm sort of extrapolating here, but I'm imagining the idea of masturbation was sinful and shameful also.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like everybody did it, but we didn't talk about it, and you couldn't really be open about it. And that was really a taboo kind of thing as well.
Right.
So,
and did this stuff persevere into your marriages too? This idea that, sort of shame about being sexual at all, or about being, masturbating and solo sex, or.
Yeah, the shame carried over into both marriages. And I think in all those regards, it was sort of like, well, the one place that it's okay that you're allowed to feel this is with your spouse in bed.
Right.
But anything else is like still taboo. And if you have a desire for that, or you follow through on that or whatever, that's shameful.
Okay. Yeah.
So
that's a heavy load.
Yeah, it was a load, and it was a load that mostly I didn't realize I carried until I got far enough away from it that you can look back and say, wow, that was a lot of stuff that's kind of programmed into your cells at a pretty visceral level.
Yeah, sometimes I describe that, it's the water we swim in, right? Like fish don't know the water they're in. So it's like, we're so used to it. It's so our environment, we don't realize that's not everybody's.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I started out and where I came into the marriage with Nancy.
Okay. And Nancy, how about you? What'd you bring along with you?
Oh, I had baggage that fit really well. The perfect storm, I guess.
Yeah.
Thanks, life. And so I was a sexual survivor of sexual abuse. And the way that was at a fairly young age, about 5 years old. And it continued for a couple years. And that played out in a lot of shame and guilt and dirty, like I'm dirty. There's something wrong with me. And I just wanted to just not even be connected to my body.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was exacerbated with my first sexual experience with a man that I dated for 5 years. And he kept trying to push me. And finally, when I was 17, in the back of my parents' station wagon, it was like, okay. And all he did was roll over and say, I conquered a mountain.
Oh, wow.
And that was like a dagger going through me. And I thought, nobody's going to ever control me or have me again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, from then on, sex was either be controlled and manipulated or me controlling. And I preferred to be the one to control it.
Yeah. So what would that look like? I mean, how does that manifest?
Well, I was an attractive young woman and I knew that. And so I started playing up to that manipulation, and it fed my ego of having power and dominating over men. And in high school, I had a a label as the prick teaser that would, kind of tease but never, follow through. And so I became very, very independent, never really wanted to have an intimate relationship. I did not ever masturbate because I was afraid of my own body. And I was really afraid if anybody ever asked me what pleases me.
Mm.
So, yeah, it was just not a comfortable place.
Yeah. And I'm assuming, I guess I shouldn't assume. When you say you didn't want someone to ask you what was pleasing to you, did you have any idea of what that might be at that point?
Back then, the word orgasm was mostly associated with men, and I didn't know about women, but I have a twin sister who ended up having an orgasm while riding her horse. And so she started sharing this with me, and I found the competitive side in me coming up. And it's like my twin, she can't have this, without first or whatever.
Right.
I'm a little curious about it, but I also was intimidated about it. And I just was confused and I didn't know what to do about it.
Yeah.
So basically, I wanted to just shut it out and say, I don't need that.
Right. So when you say it's a perfect storm, tell me a little bit about how the two of you, when you got together and what was happening earlier in your sex life when there were challenges, how did these things fit together?
Well, Frank had wanted to, we were married now. He wanted to explore. He wanted this freedom. He wanted to be able to be, free and have all of that. And it was, I would talk about masturbation and he was like, I didn't get married to masturbate. I got married to explore all of these things. And for me, I remember at nighttime and when it was time to go to bed, I would spend a lot of time in the bathroom until I was sure he was asleep.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was sort of like this continual battle of, a classic thing of I wanted more than she wanted. And so I felt like I was always asking and, she wasn't available and she'd say, well, I'm just fine. So it must be your problem. And I felt like, no, wait a minute, this is the way this is supposed to work. And so this kind of back and forth battle went on for quite some time.
Yeah, in every relationship, there's somebody that wants more sex than the other person. Like that's always true, right? And it's very common, of course, for people to get into the traps of that. So partly you're describing that exact thing, and yet it's complicated by this baggage, basically, you've brought in, right? That's making your polarization even bigger, seems to me.
Yeah. And once I learned about Nancy's sexual history, which she opened up to me about over time, then I wanted to try to create a safe place for us to be able to explore it. And to her great credit, she was willing to look at what her history had done to her.
Yeah.
But it was very challenging for both of us to try to bridge that gap between, hey, here's what I want, and gee, she felt this need to control and or be controlled because she'd never known anything else. And I distinctly remember the time when she shared that with me in the car. We were on our way somewhere, and it was just like a huge light bulb came on for me when I began to realize, wow, this is what you've been living with all these years, and I see why you got that way. Now the question is, how can we open this up and create a place where you don't feel like you have to manipulate, but you can feel like it's safe?
Right. So how long had you been together at that point? Like how long were you married when you had that conversation in the car?
I'm going to say about 3 years, maybe. Does that sound about right?
To complicate matters, I got pregnant right after Frank and I got married. And so it was 2 months into the marriage. And so we had one child and then another one. So, you create.
Yeah.
It just complicates things even more. And, I was nursing and all of just feeling like my body was just used up. And so I didn't have anything left over for him.
Right. That makes sense. Now, had you shared the story of the abuse ever before in your life?
That was early on. In fact, I think one of the things that attracted you to me was just how open and honest I was with him on our first date.
Mm-hmm.
And my control thing was just really running rampant on that. And I looked at him and I thought, well, he's probably not my type. And so I thought, this will be nice to go out and then we'll probably be history because I'm just going to throw it all out there and see what he does with it. Well, he was attracted to my honesty. So,
yeah. I didn't learn about the childhood sexual abuse stuff until after we were married.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's right.
So that was a pretty big surprise.
Right.
Of course, I had no experience in how you deal with such things at that point. And so I strongly encouraged Nancy to get some professional help on that, which to her eternal credit, she did.
Right.
And stepped up to the plate. And I mean, that's a very hard road to walk down, to face down a sexual abuse history. And it was hard for me because while she's in the middle of dealing with it, it's not, for her at least, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it wasn't comfortable. It was a very challenging time, and she didn't particularly feel sexual during that time.
Right.
Wanting to support her, but it's like, well, yeah, and I have needs too. So how do we bridge this gap? And a lot of that just comes through talking and communicating and trying to be as patient and understanding of each other, knowing that we're each a contributor and a partner in this. And if I can spend as much time thinking about her situation and her needs as I think about my own, that helps me to be more accommodating and try to understand what she's going through.
Right.
We had a kind of a joke between the two of us that we would deal with my baggage for the first 7 years, with his baggage for the next 7 years. And we're married 14 years, we'll have it all together.
A long-term view. I like that. Yeah. I mean, certainly one thing I was going to say is it sounds like as much as you guys got kind of caught in the trap of this stuff and there was some frustration and avoidance and stress, it doesn't sound, at least you haven't made it sound like it got toxic, or really like there was fighting or nastiness between the two of you. Or did I just miss that?
No,
I wouldn't say that it got nasty.
I could talk to that one.
I'll let you
go ahead.
I came from a background where there was fighting was kind of out there. He came from the opposite one where it was the silent Cold War kind of thing. And so I wanted a good fight with him. And I would just go in there and dig, and he'd say, I don't want to say anything I'd have to regret later. And it was so frustrating for me because I loved the heat of the fight, and he just fight.
So another way where baggage fits right together, right? That's the frustration.
But I don't want to say it was a smooth ride along the way. It was a very rocky ride.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that both of us were really committed to the marriage, and we were committed to staying together, for our kids. And we were committed to each other and to learning. And we were able to get past what I suspect may, for many couples, be the most difficult mountain is we got out of the trap of it's all your fault.
Yeah.
Blaming it all on the other one.
Right.
We're both willing to look at our own stuff and say, okay, each of us is bringing something to this confabule or whatever it's called.
Perfect.
And try to work through what that was.
And you're right, Frank. I mean, that's when stuff can change, right? When we're not pathologizing each other and we're not blaming and pointing out the other person's problems, but when you can look at your own contribution, because of course that's the only part you can change, right? Is your own part of the dance. So that's great to hear that you guys were able to take this and think, wait, I've got some stuff here, right? What's my part of this? And have empathy for each other, compassion, right? For the position of the other person.
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful tools that we had in this whole thing was being able to, in varying degrees at certain points, be able to imagine what it is like to be the other person.
Yeah.
and what they're going through. And wow, if I was going through all that, yeah, I'd probably feel that way too. So given that and my own feelings, how can we move this to a higher level that meets both of our needs?
Right. Hey, it's Jessa here, just taking a quick break in the show. So glad you're with me today. I want to invite you to be a part of the conversation. I run a free Facebook group called Sex, Intimacy, and Relationships. And I share articles and resources. I foster conversation and community. I'm there to answer questions if you post them. And I broadcast live, delivering information, ideas, inspiration that could help you with your sex life. I'd love to have you join me there. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/community. All right, so talk a little bit about that journey. Obviously, Nancy, I guess sounds like you were doing some therapy around the sexual abuse, but what were the parts of the journey and how did you work together? What kind of communication did you have to transform this?
I think I'm kind of an internal processor, which made Frank feel alone in a lot of that.
Yeah.
But in my thinking, I realized he was totally committed to me, to be monogamous in our relationship. And I started thinking, how would I feel if I reached the end of my life looking back and I never got to feel satisfied in intimacy and the depth that's possible with this one person that I've shared my whole life with? And he was always so romantic, like with a capital R. And I thought, this is really special that I have this, and yet I've been kind of it at arm's length. And so in that reflective time, I let that just play on my mind. And he was really good at creating a safe place for me when I finally decided to deal with orgasm. When I first experienced it, I had convulsions like I wanted to throw up. And he would just hold me and he would tell me how beautiful it was for me to be able to open up with him. And I just kept seeing how safe and how important and how romantic. And the control piece for me early on, we'd go on these getaways. And if the room wasn't the way I wanted the room, I would always find an excuse why it wasn't the perfect situation.
Yeah.
I just kind of roll with it. I remember one time we went to this one place and I thought it was this bed and breakfast out on this big farm. And it ended up, it was a farm, but they put this freeway practically next to it. And all we heard was all these cars going by. And Frank had said, well, why don't we just pretend like it's the ocean wave? And I just thought that was so sweet. And so I went on that journey with him. So little by little, I started adopting his stories that he was bringing into our life. So he was a real coach for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I hear this, the support Frank could offer you and your willingness, openness to think about his experience and what's possible. To sort of maintain that in your mind instead of being completely driven by fear, which of course is so easy to do, right, as a person.
Right.
Yeah.
And because of my past wanting independence and I was the rebel in my family, I was able to put that on and see how it would feel to be limited and stifled by another person.
Yeah.
When you're so committed to this relationship.
Right.
And I think for me, watching her take on that position, that she was willing to do the work, she was willing to face down hard stuff, she was willing to look at her own self and not project it all on me. It gave me such huge hope that I was just willing to hang in there for a long time while she worked through that. And of course, I got my own baggage I was working through. So it's not like it's all hers, but that seeing that willingness to go at it just gave me continual hope to hang in there and think we can make this work and we can get through this stuff and we can come out on the other side and, it'll be a wonderful, beautiful thing. And the journey and the struggle is, of course, part of the richness of it all.
Right.
That you end up with. Sometimes that's hard to see when you're in the middle of
It doesn't feel very rich.
Yeah, it's like, oh, really? This is the richness, huh? But that was huge, and so I wanted to create. I could see the pain she was in, and I wanted to create a safe place where, no matter what happened, she knew that she'd be safe with me in our intimate times.
Yeah.
And there wouldn't be any shame or criticism or anything negative, but it would all be supportive.
Yeah. And once that came together with the safety and all of that, I ended up needing to have a whole pelvic floor rebuild surgery.
Oh, wow.
And that was probably the most painful recovery I've ever had. And, the doctors just say, oh, after 6 weeks, you can begin having sex again. Well, 6 months, it was still really painful. And I was very open in our communication, and I was very open to keep trying. And Frank never wanted to hurt me. And so he would just encourage me to keep talking through it. And it was probably a good year, I think, little by little. And you can speak to it, but I think at times you wondered if we would ever be able to have sex again, right?
Yeah.
It did cross my mind that this might be the end of our sex life. And if that's that, well, okay, then we'll figure something else out.
Yeah, I think.
I guess it depends how you define sex, right? Like that's
right.
Right. It's the end of maybe penetrative or vaginally penetrative sex.
Right. Lots of other possibilities out there.
Right.
So we looked at it as an opportunity to explore other means of intimacy and still keep trying, but just be aware of where my body was.
Yeah. Yeah. So Frank, would you speak a little bit to your baggage? And you said, like, I didn't realize I carried the shame and negativity until looking back. And it's very easy for people to think that the lower desire partner is the one with the problem, right? They're the one that's broken and we've got to fix that. But of course, every situation is co-created. It's like our stuff fits together. So tell me more about how you were discovering your half of this equation and what was that work like for you?
Yeah, so it didn't, I don't think the reality of how that fear, shame, and guilt stuff was still playing on me came until many years into the marriage. And just to give you a sense of it, there came a point, and I'm trying to think of the chronology of when, but I was going to say is maybe 20 years in.
Wow.
That I finally gathered up my courage enough to tell Nancy, I would like to look at some pornography. And just even saying that out loud to another person took all that time to gather up that much courage because of all the shame around that. And to my surprise, she was, because again, we had created a safe place to share. She was supportive and said, "Can I join you in that?" And so we did. And interestingly enough, after a while, I got rather bored with what I was watching. But I guess the reason I bring that up was to give you an idea of just how difficult it was to even verbalize that to my closest friend and life companion.
Yeah.
So shame around that desire to look at naked bodies was just huge.
Yeah.
And so a bunch of my growing out of that was beginning to accept myself and not shame myself around those kinds of things, but to accept that that's who I was, to go back and, do some work with my, 10 and 11 and 12 and 13-year-old self inside of me that felt those things and had no outlet for them in those years, and slowly begin to get comfortable with it's okay for me to, enjoy my body. It's okay for me to pleasure myself. And Nancy was incredibly supportive as I would talk through this. Again, I was very frightened too.
Yeah.
I've been frightened of it my whole life. But she was very supportive in both listening and creating a safe place for me to talk about that, so that it could get to the point where if I felt sexual and she didn't, then I felt like, okay, I could go masturbate, and there's no shame in that. She's totally supportive of that. And that whole process and discussion itself became part of our shared intimacy.
Right, right.
And it gave me more of a sense of being able to shed that old fear, shame, and guilt, and own my own self, and be able to be, if you will, more independent in my sexuality, which in turn made our intimacy that much deeper.
Yeah, yeah. I bet it also breaks this idea that not only is a marriage bed the only place you're supposed to enjoy sex, it becomes like the only place for a sexual outlet, right? So the pressure on her to be your, for your sexual satisfaction. It's like, wait. These can be two separate things, right? Like, Nancy does not have to solve your ever sexual whim, right?
Yeah, and that was the environment, or what I carried out of my upbringing was it's got to be all her.
Right.
It puts horrible pressure on your spouse.
Yes,
and an unfair pressure.
Right.
So working through that was a huge expansion of our intimacy, a huge expansion of my own self-confidence and self-esteem in myself. And again, that ability to be more independent, contrary to, it seems counterintuitive, but it brought deeper intimacy between the two of us.
Absolutely. And can I just ask, did you do most of that work just internally in your own head, or were you also in therapy, or was there somewhere else that you sort of sought out support?
Yeah, so kind of several. I do a lot of reading. And I've been interested in psychology and self-help related kinds of things around that for years. So I've read lots of stuff. And at the same time, I was getting therapy myself, and have a number of times over the years. And that was an area that I was working through with my own therapist as well. So I was kind of getting helpful input from Nancy, from my therapist, from books I was reading.
Yeah.
And
it all aligned.
Yeah, lots of different sources.
Right. All right. So bring us to the happy ending. How long have you guys been together? And what does, without being too personal, what does your sex life look like these days?
So I think in terms of being together, we're closing in on 30 years. Married probably 28, something in there. And sex life is really nice. It has just grown in its depth to where I think both of us are willing to, without fear, speak up about what we want. Like, I would like to make love with you this afternoon.
Yeah.
Or can we set aside some time to have sex tonight, or something? And if it works, great. If the other one says, "Oh, I got some commitments tonight, but I hear you. Could we do something tomorrow?" Then it's like, okay. And neither of us takes that personally.
Yeah.
So we're able to have that kind of freedom. And then the freedom of what, actually happens in the bedroom also has grown, because we both just appreciate most the intimacy. I mean, and the connection. I mean, in my younger days, achieving orgasm and so forth was sort of the end goal. I think as we grow older, that urgency for the end goal, it doesn't go away, but it wanes, or it takes a backseat to a growing appreciation of just the connection and the intimacy. Yeah. So we just have a lot of play, and it can take on a variety of different forms. And I think we've reached the point where neither of us is particularly invested in an outcome as much as we just want to enjoy each other and feel connected.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've kind of discovered over the years that when we start to get a little snippy with each other, sometimes we'd just say, let's go have sex and see if we still feel the same way. And it just meant that connection. And they just kind of dissipated whatever that little snippiness was about. And so just to know that balances us out was really reassuring for me. When Frank had mentioned the porn situation, it ended up being a healing factor for me because, here he had introduced it and I was kind of like, okay, I'll be open to it. But seeing other women's vaginal area and recognizing that that's like me and he thinks it's beautiful. And it helped me put my head on differently about the vagina and that it isn't such an ugly thing and it's just the female version. So I ended up wanting to watch more than he did. He started getting bored and I became fascinated and opening up more and more. And so I kind of went one way and he went another way, which was a surprise.
Yeah.
So these days I would just say that it can look like many different things and it doesn't always have to be about penetration. And we've taken it to, I think about being romantic on just a walk on the beach. I have these feelings of just the everyday little things of falling in love with him over and over and over again, which I never thought would happen after 28 years of marriage.
Wow. I mean, so much of what you guys are talking about with this sort of flexibility and ease and no outcome and expectation and the collaboration. I mean, all this stuff is the stuff I strive to get with clients, right? This is what I'm trying to describe to people as possibilities. And, in the early days of when you're stuck, it doesn't seem possible, right? You can probably relate to that. Where you guys have gotten now, it's like you can't even conceive of that back in the days when you're butting heads over this, right?
Yeah.
But it really is possible. Any final thoughts about words of advice? I mean, if what do you want to say to the listeners who may, we have no idea what situation they're in, but
hang in there with your partner. Talk a lot and listen very deeply to what the other is saying and how they're experiencing it. And that can just make wonders happen.
Yeah, I would say recognizing that there's two stories and it's really important that you have a voice for your own and that you listen to the other person's with that heart-centered listening without creating a comeback or anything. You just open your heart up to what's here for me.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much. I so appreciate you sharing the story.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.